A duel was a very particular kind of fight. It was a formal, arranged combat between two individuals, usually men. They fought with deadly weapons, following a strict set of rules. The whole point was not just to win a fight, but to settle a point of honor. Imagine someone insults your family, your wife, or even just your good name. In certain periods of European history, a public apology might not be enough to wipe the slate clean. The insult, or the perceived slight, left a stain upon your reputation. A duel was seen as the only way to wash that stain away, often with blood. It was a serious, dramatic, and often fatal business. The idea of the duel as we know it really took off in the 15th and 16th centuries, particularly among the aristocracy. It grew out of the older medieval tradition of the judicial combat, or trial by combat. In the Middle Ages, two knights might fight to let God decide who was telling the truth in a legal dispute. But the duel of the Renaissance and beyond was different. It wasn't about God's judgment in a court of law. It was a private matter, an affair of personal honor. This new kind of duel became incredibly fashionable, first in Italy and then spreading like wildfire across France, Spain, and England. It was a way for gentlemen to prove their courage and social standing. So why did people risk their lives over a few crosswords? It was all about a very specific code of conduct. For a gentleman of the time, his honor was his most valuable possession. It was more important than his property, and sometimes even more important than his life. To allow an insult to go unanswered was to show weakness. It suggested you were a coward, and in the highly competitive world of the European courts, that could mean social ruin. A duel was a performance. It was a public statement that you were a man who would defend his reputation to the death, and that was a powerful message to send. This culture of honor was deeply embedded in the upper layers of society. While the duel might seem barbaric to us today, it was governed by an intricate, if unwritten, set of social expectations. It was a response to a world where a man's reputation was everything. The duel was a ritual, a piece of theater where the actors played for the highest stakes imaginable. It was a bloody, dangerous, and illegal practice. Yet for centuries, it was an accepted, and sometimes even expected part of being a European gentleman. The threat of a duel regulated how people spoke to one another, creating a strange kind of politeness born from the fear of a pistol at dawn. Not just anyone could fight a duel. This was almost exclusively a privilege, if you can call it that, of the aristocracy and the gentry. A nobleman would not typically accept a challenge from a common merchant or a farmer. The duel was a contest between social equals. To fight a man was to acknowledge him as your peer. The entire process was meant to be orderly and civilized, at least until the fighting started. The whole affair was managed by seconds. Each duelist would have a friend, his second, who would act as a go-between. The seconds would try to negotiate a peaceful resolution first, perhaps by arranging a formal apology. If words failed, the seconds had the crucial job of arranging the grim details of the meeting. They would decide on the time and the place. A secluded spot at dawn was traditional, away from the prying eyes of the law. They would also agree upon the weapons. In the early days, swords like the rapier were the weapon of choice. This required considerable skill and training. Later, from the 18th century onwards, pistols became increasingly popular. Pistols were seen as the great equalizer. A man's skill with a sword mattered little when faced with a lead ball fired from a gun. The choice of weapon was critical and often determined the outcome before a single shot was fired. On the appointed day, the duelists and their seconds would meet at the chosen location. The atmosphere would have been incredibly tense. The seconds would perform their final duties. They would measure the distance between the combatants, a standard distance being 10 or 12 paces. They would load the pistols, often in full view of each other, to ensure there was no foul play. The rules of engagement were then explained, even though everyone knew them. For a pistol duel, the combatants might stand back to back, walk a set number of paces, turn, and fire on a signal. Or they might stand facing each other and fire simultaneously. The objective was not always to kill. The primary goal was to achieve satisfaction. This meant that honor had been restored. Sometimes the first wound, no matter how minor, was enough to end the duel. This was called deloping, or firing into the air, and was sometimes done as a sign that you did not want to kill your opponent, but were simply there to prove your courage. However, many duels did end in death or serious injury. If one party was killed, the survivor and the seconds could face murder charges. Yet, for many years, courts and juries were often very lenient, seeing it as a crime of honor rather than cold-blooded murder. History is littered with the stories of famous men who stood on the dueling ground. One of the most famous duels in American history, which was still steeped in European tradition, involved two of its founding fathers. In 1804, the sitting vice president, Aaron Burr, killed his longtime political rival, Alexander Hamilton, in a pistol duel in New Jersey. The two men had a bitter history of personal and political disagreements. The fatal duel was sparked by insults Hamilton had allegedly made about Burr. The death of Hamilton, a brilliant and influential figure, shocked the nation and effectively ended Burr's political career, helping to turn public opinion against dueling. Across the Atlantic, literary figures were not immune to the call of honor. Russia's greatest poet, Alexander Pushkin, was a veteran of many duels. He was a man of fiery temperament and fiercely protective of his wife's reputation. In 1837, he challenged a French cavalry officer, Georges Danter, whom he suspected of having an affair with his wife. They met in the snow outside St. Petersburg. Dantes fired first, mortally wounding Pushkin in the stomach. The poet lingered in agony for 2 days before dying. His death was a national tragedy for Russia, robbing the country of its most beloved literary voice at the age of just 37. Politics and dueling often went hand in hand in Britain as well. In 1798, the Prime Minister himself, William Pitt the Younger, fought a duel. His opponent was a member of Parliament named George Tierney. Tierney had accused Pitt in the House of Commons of not wanting peace with France. Pitt took this as an attack on his personal integrity and issued a challenge. They met on a Sunday afternoon on Putney Heath, near London. Both men fired their pistols and, quite remarkably, both missed. Honor was declared satisfied, and they left the field unharmed. It's an extraordinary thought, the leader of the country risking his life over a parliamentary debate. Another dramatic political duel took place in 1829. This time, it involved another prime minister, the Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo. Wellington was supporting a controversial bill to grant more civil rights to Catholics. A fiercely anti-Catholic aristocrat, the Earl of Winchelsea, accused the Duke in the newspapers of using the bill as a trick to introduce popery into Britain. The Duke, a man who lived by a strict code of honor, felt he had no choice but to issue a challenge. They met in Battersea Fields. Both men deliberately aimed wide, firing their pistols without intent to harm. With this symbolic act, honor was satisfied, and the Iron Duke's point was made. By the middle of the 19th century, the long tradition of dueling was beginning to die out across Europe. Several factors contributed to its decline. A new way of thinking was taking hold, influenced by the rise of the middle class. These were practical people, industrialists, merchants, and professionals. They had a different set of values. Their idea of honor was more closely tied to financial credit, reliability, and a good family name, not a willingness to fight and die over a perceived insult. The dramatic, aristocratic ritual of the duel seemed increasingly ridiculous and old-fashioned to this new, powerful section of society. Governments also began to take a much harder line. For centuries, dueling had been illegal, but the laws were often weakly enforced. Juries were reluctant to convict a gentleman for defending his honor, but that began to change. New, more stringent laws were passed, and the courts began to enforce them with real purpose. In Britain, a pivotal moment came in 1844 when the army amended its Articles of War. Officers were now explicitly forbidden from challenging others or acting as seconds. Instead, they were encouraged to seek resolution through their commanding officer. This removed the social pressure to duel within the very group where it had been most entrenched. The press also played a role in changing public attitudes. Newspapers, which were becoming more widely read, began to report on duels not as glamorous affairs of honor, but as foolish and tragic events. They would often satirize the duelists, portraying them as arrogant peacocks willing to throw their lives away for trivial reasons. This public mockery was a powerful weapon. It chipped away at the very thing the duel was meant to protect, a man's public reputation. Being seen as a hot-headed fool who engaged in an outdated ritual was becoming more damaging to one's honor than walking away from a fight. Ultimately, the duel tells us a great deal about how European ideas of honor and society have changed. It represents a world governed by a rigid, personal, and often violent code of conduct, exclusive to a small elite. Its disappearance marks the transition to a more modern, more democratic, and perhaps more sensible world. A world where disputes are settled in courtrooms, not on misty fields at dawn. The idea that your reputation could be cleansed by firing a pistol at another human being no longer made sense. Honor had not disappeared, but its definition had profoundly and permanently changed.